Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Up front this week, the future of Spaceport America and space tourism. Following the successful Virgin Galactic launch with company founder Richard Branson, hopes are high. For a look at the launch and a conversation with an aerospace expert, here's Madison Staten.
1, release, release, release. Clean release.
With one final countdown, the VSS Unity made history, launching into space as Virgin Galactic's first fully crewed spaceflight. On board, 2 pilots and 4 mission specialists, including founder Richard Branson, who addressed the public from space.
To all you kids down there, I was once a child with a dream, looking up to the stars. Now I'm an adult in a spaceship with lots of other wonderful adults looking down to our beautiful, beautiful Earth. To the next generation of dreamers, if we can do this, just imagine what you can do. Hey!
The VSS Unity launched horizontally from Spaceport America. The spacecraft was attached to its mothership VMS Eve at launch, before purposely separating in the air. Branson reflected on the trip following the successful completion of the flight, noting the importance of continuing to explore commercial spaceflight.
When you are floating, you're looking out of these giant windows back at this beautiful, beautiful sky, beautiful Earth back down here, and it is indescribable.
The launch is not only good for Virgin Galactic, but it could also brighten the future for Spaceport America, a public investment of about $250 million by New Mexicans. John Haas is an associate principal engineer at the NASA Engineering and Safety Center, speaking independently, not on behalf of NASA. He noted the optimal location of Spaceport America, even when considering potential launch sites in larger coastal areas.
There are spaceports being constructed or talked about near oceans. Oceans are convenient. You kind of have a free buffer zone there if you have an accident or if you have a spacecraft that's designed to land in the water. New Mexico doesn't have that issue. There's a lot of land available there which isn't inhabited by people. And so you have an opportunity to launch spacecraft from land where the weather is better and more stable.
Some critics of commercial spaceflight cite environmental concerns from fuel burned. Haas says that while all spacecrafts have significant environmental impacts, there are currently so few spacecrafts, the impact is minor. He noted future discussion and public debate on the issue will be critical. While Haas says it's too soon to determine if space tourism will be a lucrative business for New Mexico, he emphasized the Virgin Galactic launch is a step toward that future.
I think if you look back to the origins of commercial aviation, we're only about 100 years into this. That took off very quickly once it was demonstrated as safe and effective. I think we're just seeing the very beginnings of that with commercial spaceflight.
Increased activity at Spaceport America is something Las Cruces Mayor Ken Miyagishima welcomes, saying events like the VSS Unity launch boost economic growth in the region.
Today is all the various people from all over the world coming here to get a glimpse of Sir Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic and the kickoff of space tourism. So that's huge.
If Branson has his way, this flight will only be the beginning of a booming commercial space industry, one he says should be accessible to all. Right now, that's definitely not the case, with flights costing $250,000. Branson is not the only billionaire investing in space travel. Amazon's Jeff Bezos and Tesla's Elon Musk are also independently investing in commercial spaceflight. Bezos, through his company Blue Origin, plans to travel higher than the VSS Unity, crossing the Kármán line, approximately 62 miles above sea level. It's recognized by some internationally as the true start of space, but federal agencies like NASA use a different definition, instead measuring the beginning of space from the 50-mile mark. Branson, who reached an altitude of 53.5 miles, says his mission to space was successful.
Really wasn't a race. We're just delighted that everything went so fantastically well. We wish Jeff the absolute best, and the people who are going up with him during his flight.
As the future of commercial spaceflight takes shape, NASA Associate Principal Engineer John Haas underscored how the VSS Unity launch embodies the spirit of American entrepreneurship.
It's kind of a neat thing to happen in New Mexico. Spaceflight is an inherently risky thing to do, and the key to all of that is to make very informed decisions based on your risk. But that's the story of entrepreneurship, right? I mean, that's American entrepreneurship, international entrepreneurship. So in a way, that's a good thing.
For KRWG Public Media, I'm Madison Staten.
The University of North Carolina tracks the loss of newspapers across the country. Its most recent report from last year looked at the industry's decline from 2004 through 2019. During that period, more than 2,000 newspapers were lost, and there was a 44% drop in circulation overall. Yes, circulation nearly cut in half. Many communities are now without a local paper. Many more only have a weekly outlet or a diminished daily paper. And lots of people say a lack of local news coverage is contributing to divisions in society and an erosion of trust in the media and other institutions. My guests today include Dr. Lindsay Green-Barber and Hannah Stonebraker. They are from Impact Architects, which studied the news landscape in New Mexico and many other places across the country for the Knight Foundation. Lindsay, I want to begin with a very big question and an important one. In your view, what does the loss of newspapers mean for this country?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here to talk about this today, Fred. It's so important. I think it's important to state at the outset that newspapers are just one form of news and information, but surely the loss of local reporting and locally based reporters is a huge problem for the US right now. We've seen, as all of your viewers know, less community cohesion and greater polarization across the country at the same time that we've seen these declines in local newspapers. And there's significant research that suggests that local reporting is really critical for bridging these gaps across different sectors of the community and contributing to a shared sense of community and of identity. And it's worth noting that newspapers in particular have a complicated history in the US, and they've often contributed to racist and patriarchal systems and communities. And there's much work to be done, and that is being done by local news organizations to help rectify some of those relationships.
Such important issues. Hannah, tell me about your research. You looked at a diverse mix of places across the country.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us and for highlighting this work. The work was supported by the Knight Foundation, as you mentioned, Democracy Fund, and Google News Initiative. And we looked at case studies across 9 different communities in the United States. And the idea was to apply a framework to a real variety of places. We looked at some municipalities, some counties, and then we looked at New Mexico as a state, which is a really interesting one to look at. And as your viewers know, there's lots of unique things about New Mexico that you wouldn't find in other local news environments.
What stood out most to you about New Mexico?
Yeah, as it's an incredibly diverse and relatively diffuse state. There aren't that many dense centers of population, and that really impacts the type of local news that you see. 4 different counties are news deserts, meaning they don't have a single local newspaper. And that's about 125,000 people who don't have any concentrated newspaper just committed to their community. So there's a huge need for more local news, but there's also a huge need for greater diversity. New Mexico is a highly diverse place. There are so many different communities and not a lot of news catering to specific information needs in those communities. Radio stations are the most popular in New Mexico and the most present. It's unsurprising given just the geographic vastness of New Mexico and that radio is kind of easiest to disperse. There's also a need for more philanthropic funding. There's a lot of philanthropy going into news right now, but in a place like New Mexico, on a per capita basis, there isn't as much as there should be in order to really support the state. There are some really great institutions doing amazing work, though. The New Mexico Local News Fund is specifically centered around strengthening local news in New Mexico. But there are a lot of challenges and a lot of uphill battles in order to strengthen the news enough to provide everyone with the information they need and they want.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have more time later to talk about philanthropy. The New Mexico Local News Fund, KRWG Public Media, I should say, has been a beneficiary of that because we participated in a collaboration funded by the Local News Fund to improve reporting on the state legislative session. Speaking of money, Lindsay, your work cites a report by the nonprofit New Mexico First, and it notes a problem here that is also evident in many other places around the country, and that's a lack of qualified journalists due to low pay.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, not only in New Mexico, as you said, and there are many reasons for this, and we could spend, way longer than 20 minutes talking about all of the structural issues that are a factor here. But low pay is one of them, and that has to do with just the challenges around sustainability in news and information in general, and the fact that there is no one business model that can support news and information. And it's really important in any ecosystem to have a diversity of business models. We can talk more about that perhaps. But
yeah, and it's so important to mention because, of course, newspapers, part of this incredible decline that I mentioned at the top of this conversation is that they used to receive so much more revenue from advertising, and with certainly getting subscriptions to online content, that's worked really well for the New York Times or the Washington Post, but not so well for many smaller newspapers that are simply seeing a decline in subscription revenue, and then at the same time a massive decline in advertising. The New Mexico First report also found a growing amount of marketing content masquerading as news. And Lindsay, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that because it's something that's alarming and some would argue may further hurt news organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to point back to one thing that you mentioned also about subscription rates. And one of the challenges here is that in some cases, subscription rates for local publications may have declined somewhat. And in the past year, actually, due to many things, the pandemic, a need for local news and information, elections that were requiring a lot of information and coverage, many local publications that are still around actually saw their subscriptions increasing. The challenge is that the incentive structure for these businesses, as they have been acquired by large corporations, by hedge funds that have larger demands and needs for profit margins, means that even if you have more subscriptions and even if you're making more revenue than you did the year before, the kind of powers that be still are requiring greater margins. And so you still end up with layoffs. And so you get this kind of vicious cycle happening. So just wanted to point out that, and again, this is not just a plug for public media, but when you are thinking about ownership structure for, if you are subscribing or you're becoming a member, to think about that ownership and what the incentives are. And, paying for membership to public media, those resources then get reinvested into the organization in a way that they may not for a legacy commercially owned newspaper.
Sure.
So that's one thing. But then the question about, content that's masquerading as news or sponsored content, this is a symptom, again, of a misalignment between the financial incentive structures of news and the public service mission that drives news organizations or the news organizations are aiming to play. And as news organizations are struggling to find pathways to financial sustainability, sponsored content, unfortunately, has emerged as one of the ways that organizations are able to find revenue. And I think the jury is still out to some extent about how does different kind of labeling help indicate to an audience person, this is essentially advertising versus this is a news story. And I think we're seeing that it's eroding trust, but we don't have a definitive answer there yet.
Yeah.
My empathy is with those organizations that are struggling to find a way to just generate revenue.
Yeah, and you see this even on national websites like USA Today, their website, where it'll say sponsored content. And it looks like there's a headline and a photo. It looks like it's a news story, but in fact, it's just marketing. And I get the sense that this is increasing dramatically. I get emails every day from folks who want to do sponsored content on our website, something we of course do not do. Speaking of this issue, Hannah, New Mexico First says there is a need for better media literacy. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think media literacy is a huge part of the puzzle. You have to look for that sponsored content, piece when you're looking at different news articles that look like news articles but might not be. But there's also a huge responsibility here of the news organizations themselves. They can do a lot more work in ensuring that their content is presented in a way that's clear to the audience, what it is, where it's coming from, why they should trust them. A huge number of people don't know the difference between an opinion piece and a journalistic investigative reporting piece, because you flip through a newspaper and they're presented pretty similarly, layout's the same. And so, there are community-based journalism organizations that are really trying hard to reach people in innovative ways that can help strengthen media literacy. Organizations trying SMS messaging, broadcast radio, which we know in New Mexico has been really successful.
Yeah.
In-person events has grown to really strengthen the relationship between journalists and their community, which can help so much with media literacy.
And, media literacy, of course, Hannah, important for another reason. Beyond the issue of marketing content making its way into the news, of course, there's also the issue of lots of false information online and folks going to that information thinking it's a credible news source when it's not. What can be done, in your view, to combat this kind of thing in addition to media literacy training?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in some ways it's one of the huge questions of the day, and it has a lot to do with our technology companies just as much as it has to do with our news organizations. Structurally, there needs to be some regulation of platforms where misinformation from untrustworthy news sites circulate. But there also needs to be enforcement of current regulations that exist, but because we've never had technology or networks happening in this scale before, they've never been enforced. A lot of it then also has to do with strengthening that trust and relationship between news organizations and the people that they're aiming to serve. You build that trust, people see the reporters in the news organization, they see that they're there for the community, and it makes it easier to notice those are trustworthy sources that have a process and ethical guidelines versus a misinformation story that's spreading like wildfire because it's super interesting were it real, but it's often not.
Yeah, absolutely. Lindsay, in the report, you cite data showing that online sources have eclipsed every other source for news. Yet in states like New Mexico, with large rural populations, lots of people don't even have high-speed internet access, something we often refer to as the digital divide. Tell me your thoughts about the implications of this dynamic.
Yeah, you almost can't overstate what a problem this is in the country right now. And if we learned anything in the past year about the digital divide and the effect that has on student learners and their ability to access, digital classrooms during a pandemic, we really just saw this divide play out in so many really like tangible sort of ways. And I think there's a lot of hope right now where if we're going to start treating actual access and digital infrastructure as just that, as a public service and part of our national infrastructure, I think that is really important and shouldn't be divorced from the conversations we're having about access to news and information also as a public service or a public good. And beyond that, one of the reasons that digital startups or news startups so often go digital is it's the least expensive way to put information out there. And you see a lot of innovation around, digital podcasting, which again is a great way to get information into, for example, predominantly Spanish-speaking communities where the way information is consumed and most trusted is through the radio historically. But what does that mean if you don't actually have access, or if you don't have 5G even to be able to download it, even if you can't plug in your laptop or your computer? So getting that infrastructure is critically important. And in the interim, thinking as a news organization about what the efforts are, what does it look like to reach communities in a place like New Mexico, where so many folks are rural or living in rural areas. What does it look like to think about broadcast radio or partnerships? And you mentioned, collaboration earlier. And so how can news organizations collaborate to take advantage of that broadcast infrastructure that somewhere like KRWG has, but in order to get reporting that maybe a digital first investigative news organization is doing the work for and getting out there. And so, I think those are some of the ways that an ecosystem can come together, and you can really think about where collaborative reporting and news can help to ensure that the information is reaching diverse sectors of the community.
Sure, and I want to be able to wrap up our conversation with hope. So Lindsay, I want to give you a chance to talk about one of the hopeful signs and that is the growth in philanthropy in supporting news coverage nationwide.
Yeah, there's been a rapid increase. I think I just saw Media Impact Funders, an organization that kind of convenes philanthropy that supports news and information, came out with a report today that it's hundreds of millions of dollars from local local foundations, community and place-based foundations that have gone into news and information in the past 5 years or so. And so when you're thinking about this sector, it is just growing. There are more resources. There are more foundations that are interested in things like education or like the environment that are recognizing, wow, if you don't have a local reporter who can cover the environment, you're missing a big part of the story, right? Then people don't even know what's happening locally. Same goes for education. If you don't have a local reporter covering the school board, how are folks going to know what's happening there? And so you've got new players coming into the space. And then I think the challenge, though, is to recognize, or for some of these philanthropic entities to recognize, what is the value of journalism as a nonpartisan, independent entity that can go out and do high quality reporting with professional norms and ethics, and not to be a mouthpiece or a think tank, or there's no agenda in the reporting. And so it's not to say that this is the silver bullet and this will solve all the problems. There are still challenges, and philanthropy is playing a massive role in ensuring that local communities have access to news and information right now.
Yes, absolutely. Hannah, you cite 2 KRWG partners that benefit from donations, not just from major foundations, et cetera, but from individuals too. New Mexico In Depth and Searchlight New Mexico.
Both are really great organizations doing really important work in a state where the legacy news organizations have been declining, if not have already closed. As we spoke about before, there's 4 counties with no local news. The vast majority of counties only have 1 local news source. So both organizations are, digital first, nonpartisan, nonprofit, and they're focused on accountability journalism, on investigative work, on looking at the state and where are the stories that aren't being told that are incredibly important for people to understand. They also are looking at capacity building. How do you bring in the next generation of journalists in a way that's actually representative of the people of New Mexico, and ensure that all communities have journalists who understand their communities and can tell their stories accurately?
And Hannah, are you seeing this around the country? There have been some really high-profile examples of digital outlets like this that are nonprofit, like the Texas Tribune. Are there others, and have you seen more communities getting digital outlets like this?
For sure. There have been so many communities where these types of new, startup nonprofits, digital first, are coming into being. Lindsay and I are based in San Francisco and in the East Bay. City side, which now supports Berkeley side, and Oakland side are doing really amazing work in looking at mission-oriented nonprofit news that serves communities that have had a lot of misperceptions about them in more traditional media. So it's really important, and they're both, evidence of growing trends in both nonprofit news and digital first. And they're trying to fill this gap. But, as we've spoken about before, the money isn't there how it used to be in an advertising model. So these organizations are doing incredible work. They're filling the gap where legacy news isn't anymore, but they're still on, a pretty shoestring budget, and we need to do all we can to support them and make sure that they're as aligned with their communities as possible.
Hannah and Lindsay, we've started the conversation, a great one and a very important topic for not only the news media, but for democracy. It is just really an important issue, and we appreciate you starting the conversation on this in our community. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.